learners, welcome to week 4, lecture 19 of our course Child's Growth and Development, and we will do theories of language development. Theories of language development, we will going to cover different theories like B.F. Skinner's theory of imitation, Noam Chomsky's theory of innateness, the cognitive theory, input or interactionist theories, and there are certain references and web links for your further studies. So dear learners, in our previous lectures on language development, we have learnt about nature, concept, stages of language development, and also the concept of bilingualism and multilingualism, especially in Indian context. In this lecture, we will discuss in details about various theories of language acquisition. How child acquires language? Is it some inner mechanism or stimulus from the environment? It remains a mystery how children manage to acquire complex linguistic systems at an extremely young age. Many children become fluent users of not just one but 2 or 3 languages by the time they are 3 or 4 years old. Not only this, they also know the language they should use in a given context. That is, they acquire the capacity of keeping their linguistic systems separate and of course mix them in legitimate ways when they wish to. For behaviorists such as Pavlov and Skinner, language learning was simply a matter of stimulus-response association, acquired largely through pattern, practice, mimicry, and memorization. It was Chomsky's article, Review of Skinner's Verbal Behavior, that shook the foundations of behaviorism. Chomsky argued that unless we posit an innate language faculty, it would become difficult to explain the acquisition of complex linguistic systems, and it is mentioned in National Curriculum Framework 2005 position paper on teaching of Indian languages. Now we will discuss these theories of language development one by one. Several theories have been put forward to explain the process by which children learn to understand and speak a language. There is a table. First we see the very briefly and then explain all these theories. What are the views of behaviorist theorists? Their main idea was children imitate adults. Their correct utterances are reinforced when they get what they want or are praised, and it was proposed by Skinner. Innateness proposed by Chomsky, and he said a child's brain contains special language learning mechanisms at the time of birth. Cognitive theorists said language is just one aspect of a child's overall intellectual development, and Piaget proposed this theory. Interactionist Brunner, this theory emphasizes the interaction between children and their caregivers. So let's see in details one by one. Social learning view of language development. The social learning view suggests one mechanism for the rapid acquisition of language. According to this view, speech is acquired through a combination of operant conditioning and imitation. Operant conditioning is learning in which voluntary behavior of the child is strengthened or weakened by consequences or antecedents. Presumably, children are praised or rewarded by their parents or caretakers for making sounds approximately those of their native language. Moreover, parents often model sounds, words, or sentences for them. Together, it is contended. These basic forms of learning contribute to the rapid acquisition of language. Quite different view has been proposed by the famous psycholinguist Noam Chomsky. According to Chomsky, language acquisition is at least partly innate. Human beings have a language acquisition device, that is LAD, a built-in neural system that provides them with an intuitive grasp of grammar. And finally, cognitive theory by Slobin recognizes the importance of both innate mechanisms and learning. This theory suggests that children possess certain information processing abilities or strategies that they use in acquiring language. These are termed as operant principles and seem to be present or developed very early in life. One such operating principle seems to be pay attention to the ends of words. Children pay more attention to the end of words than to the beginnings or middles of words. Few examples from our daily life, in fact from my life only. Instead of saying or calling or addressing Vinu as Vinu, child says Nu. Also the name Sharmila, child is listening it daily as all other adults saying Sharmila, calling Sharmila. Still she used to say Ila. Another example from Odia language, Dushto Hauna Sida Thia Hao. When a mother says to child, he only repeats Sida Thia Hao, means only focusing on the last 2 or 3 words or the last word. This is in Odia language, which means do not be naughty, stand straight. This makes sense because in many languages suffixes carry important meanings. Another principle is pay attention to the order of words, and indeed word order in children's speech tends to reflect that of their parents. As word order differs greatly from one language to another. This too is an important principle. Which of these above theories, whether innateness or imitation or social cognitive theory, is correct? At present, all are supported by some evidence, but none seems sufficient by itself to account for all aspects of language development. To some extent, social learning theory is correct. However, child do not always learn through imitation or when being rewarded unless that critical age or developmental milestone is achieved. Let us now discuss in details Skinner's theory of imitation and Chomsky's theory of innateness and further cognitive theory. B.F. Skinner's theory of imitation, and he was a behaviorist psychologist, and the school of thought is behaviorism. The behaviorist psychologists developed their theories while carrying out a series of experiments on animals. They observed that rats or birds, for example, could be taught to perform various tasks by encouraging habit forming. Researchers rewarded desirable behavior, and this was known as positive reinforcement. Undesirable behavior was punished or simply not rewarded, and this is known as negative reinforcement. Behavioral psychologists opposed Chomsky's hypothesis and claimed that language is a complex, learned skill, very much like other skills like cycling, swimming, etc. They argued that language development is like a chain of responses that the child acquires through reinforcement. The behaviorist B.F. Skinner then proposed this theory as an explanation for language acquisition in humans. In verbal behavior, he stated, I quote, "The basic processes and relations which give verbal behavior its special characteristics are now fairly well understood." Much of the experimental work responsible for this advance has been carried out on other species, but the results have proved to be surprisingly free of species restriction. Recent work has shown that the methods can be extended to human behavior without serious modifications. Skinner suggested that a child imitates the language of its parents or caretakers. Successful attempts are rewarded because an adult who recognizes a word spoken by a child will praise the child and or give it what she is asking for. Successful utterances are therefore reinforced while unsuccessful ones are forgotten. But there are certain limitations of Skinner's theory of imitation. Let's see what are the limitations or criticisms of behaviorism. While there must be some truth in Skinner's explanation, there are many objections to it. What are these objections? First, language is based on a set of structures or rules. Language is based on set of structures or rules which could not be worked out simply by imitating individual utterances. The mistakes made by children reveal that they are not simply imitating their adults, but actively working out and applying rules. For example, a child who says drinked instead of drank is not copying an adult, but rather over applying a rule. The child has discovered that past tense verbs are formed by applying D, T sounds to the base form of the verb. The mistakes occur because there are irregular verbs which do not behave in the same way, and such forms are often referred to as the mistakes the child commit in this process. Not he or she is not merely imitating, but over applying the rules and thinking by himself or herself, and the errors are known as intelligent mistakes or virtuous errors. So this is the first limitation, where it is not just imitation. Language development follows a sequence of steps. The vast majority of children go through the same stages of language acquisition. There appears to be a definite sequence of steps, as we have done in our previous lectures. These are cooing, babbling, hollow phrases, telegraphic speech, and syntax. So we refer to developmental milestones. Third limitation is children are often unable to repeat what an adult says, especially if the adult utterance contains a structure the child has not yet started to use. The classic demonstration comes from the American psycholinguist David McNeill. The structure in question here involves negating verbs, and there is an interaction between child and mother. What is the interaction? See, child says, "Nobody don't like me." Mother, "No." Say, "Nobody likes me." Child again repeats the same thing, "Nobody don't like me." 8 repetitions of this dialogue. Mother, "No." Now listen carefully. Say, "Nobody likes me." Child, "Oh, nobody don't like me." McNeill, in the Genesis of Language 1966, did this experiment, and it means they simply don't copy unless and until they come to that age. Then the fourth limitation is there is evidence for a critical period for language acquisition. Children who have not acquired language by the age of about 7 will never entirely catch up. There is many examples, but I am giving two examples here. One is Jenny. The most famous example is that of Jenny, discovered in 1970 at the age of 13. She had been severely neglected, brought up in isolation, and deprived of normal human contact. Of course, she was disturbed and underdeveloped in many ways. During subsequent attempts at rehabilitation, her carers tried to teach her to speak. Despite some success, mainly in learning vocabulary, she never became a fluent speaker, failing to acquire the grammatical competence of the average 5-year-old. Another is Oksana Malaya. She was raised by the wild dogs. Still she barked like dogs, and there is no human language. Even rehabilitation doesn't become successful for Oksana Malaya. Now, after having discussed imitation by Skinner, now we will do Noam Chomsky's theory of innateness, and it is also known as nativism. Noam Chomsky published a criticism of the behaviorist theory in 1957. In addition to some of the arguments listed above, he focused particularly on the impoverished language input children receive. Adults do not typically speak in grammatically complete sentences. In addition, what the child hears is only a small sample of language. Chomsky proposed that the human brain is innately wired to learn language at a certain time in a certain way. This theory is known as nativism. He believed that in order to learn something as complex as a language, it is imperative that a grammatical structure is already hardwired in their brain even before they ever heard any language. This has been called as universal grammar. Chomsky concluded that children must have an inborn faculty for language acquisition. According to this theory, the process is biologically determined. The human species has evolved a brain whose neural circuits contain linguistic information right from the birth. The child's natural predisposition to learn language is triggered when he or she listens speech, and the child's brain is able to interpret what he hears according to the underlying principles or structures it already contains. So this natural faculty has become known as the language acquisition device, and in short we say LAD. Chomsky did not suggest that an English child is born knowing anything specific about English, of course. So he stated that all human languages share common principles. For example, they all have words for things and they all have words for actions, that is nouns and verbs. It is the child's task to establish how the specific language he hears expresses these underlying principles. For example, the LAD already contains the concept of verb tense. By listening to such forms as worked, played, patted, the child will form the hypothesis that the past tense of verbs is formed by adding the sound D, T, ID to the base form. It hardly needs saying that the process is unconscious. Chomsky does not envisage the small child lying in its cot working out grammatical rules consciously. So Chomsky have pointed that the children end up saying things they have never heard, such as dad eated whole dinner. The adults around the child would not have said something like eated. Therefore, it cannot be just the imitation of what is heard by the child. However, it would be important to note here that the language English uses ed as a suffix to refer to past tense, but there are exceptions to that rule like all other rules. These types of mistakes and grammatical errors are indicative of the fact that the child has learned a pattern but has used it with a word that does not follow this particular pattern. Sometimes we say putted, putted. So there are exceptions in English also, and the child make these intelligent errors. Chomsky's groundbreaking theory remains at the center of the debate about language acquisition. However, it has been modified both by Chomsky himself and by others. Chomsky's original position was that the lad contained specific knowledge about language. Then Dan Isaac Slobin has proposed that it may be more like a mechanism for working out the rules of language. It seems to me that the child is born not with a set of linguistic categories, but with some sort of process mechanism, a set of procedures and inference rules, if you will, that he uses to process linguistic data. These mechanisms are such that applying them to the input data, the child ends up with something which is a member of the class of human languages. The linguistic universals then are the result of an innate cognitive competence rather than the content of such a competence. Evidence to support the innateness theory work in several areas of language study has provided support for the idea of an innate language faculty. Three types of evidence are offered here. Slobin has pointed out that human anatomy is peculiarly adapted to the production of speech. We tend to speak. Unlike our nearest relatives, the great apes, we have evolved a vocal tract which allows the precise articulation of a wide repertoire of vocal sounds. Neuroscience has also identified specific areas of the brain with distinctly linguistic functions, notably Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Stroke victims provide valuable data. Depending on the site of brain damage, they may suffer a range of language dysfunction, from problems with finding words to an inability to interpret syntax. The formation of Creole varieties of English appears to be the result of the lad at work. Third is, studies of the sign languages used by the deaf have shown that far from being crude gestures replacing spoken words, these are complex, fully grammatical languages in their own right. Now, sign language is also a language. A sign language may exist in several dialects. Children learning to sign as a first language pass through similar stages to hearing children learning spoken language. Deprived of speech, the urge to communicate is realized through a manual system which fulfills the same function. There is even a signing Creole, again developed by children in Nicaragua. Now, again, there are limitations of Chomsky's theory also. What are they? Chomsky's work on language was theoretical. He was interested in grammar, and much of his work consists of complex explanations of grammatical rules. He did not study real children. The theory relies on children being exposed to language but takes no account of the interaction between children and their carers. Nor does it recognize the reasons why a child might want to speak the functions of language. In 1977, Bard and Sachs published a study of a child known as Jim, the hearing son of deaf parents. Jim's parents wanted their son to learn speech rather than the sign language they used between themselves. He watched a lot of television and listened to the radio, therefore receiving frequent language input. However, his progress was limited until a speech therapist was enlisted to work with him. Simply being exposed to language was not enough. Without the associated interaction, it meant little to him. And the last limitation, subsequent theories have placed greater emphasis on the ways in which real children develop language to fulfill their needs and interact with their environment, including other people. Now let's see the cognitive theory of language acquisition. Psychologists such as Piaget, Inhelder, and Vygotsky argued for positions that would fall between these two extreme positions. One is innateness, nativism, and another is imitation. For behaviorists, the mind was a blank slate. For cognitivists such as Chomsky, language was already there in the human mind, hardwired in the form of a universal grammar. For Piaget, language is constructed through an interaction with the environment like any other cognitive system. On the other hand, Vygotsky believed that a child's speech is essentially a result of an interaction with society. In the course of her language development, a child uses two kinds of speech, egocentric and social, one addressed to herself and the other addressed to the rest of the world. It is important to underline the fact that Piaget and Vygotsky actually worked with children and observed, documented, analyzed their cognitive development. For example, Vygotsky noticed that small children not only developed their own socially mediated speech systems but also a fairly complex pre-writing system. Over a period of time, they need to develop a complex verbal repertoire to interact with a multilingual world. The Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget placed acquisition of language within the context of a child's mental or cognitive development. He argued that a child has to understand a concept before he can acquire the particular language form which expresses that concept. A good example of this is seriation. There will be a point in a child's intellectual development when she can compare objects with respect to size, arrange them in ascending or descending order. This means that if you gave the child a number of sticks, he could arrange them in order of size. Piaget suggested that a child who had not yet reached this stage would not be able to learn and use comparative adjectives like bigger, smaller. Object permanence is another phenomena often cited in relation to the cognitive theory. During the first year of life, children seem unaware of the existence of objects they cannot see. An object which moves out of sight ceases to exist. By the time they reach the age of 18 months, children have realized the objects have an existence independently of their perception. The cognitive theory draws attention to the large increase in children's vocabulary at around this age, suggesting a link between object permanence and the learning of labels for objects. Now again, there are limitations of cognitive theory too. During the first year to 18 months, connections of the type explained above are possible to trace, but As a child continues to develop, so it becomes harder to find clear links between language and intellect. Some studies have focused on children who have learned to speak fluently despite abnormal mental development. Now we say it cognitive development. Syntax in particular does not appear to rely on general intellectual growth. Now there is one more theory, input or interactionist theories. What they say, in contrast to the work of Chomsky, more recent theorists have stressed the importance of the large language input children receive from their caregivers. Language exists for the purpose of communication and can only be learned in the context of interaction with people who want to communicate with you. Interactionist views on language acquisition are: Jerome Bruner suggests that the language behavior of adults when talking to children, known by several names by most easily referred to as child directed speech (CDS), is specially adapted to support the acquisition process. This support is often described to as scaffolding for the child's language learning. Bruner also coined the term Language Acquisition Support System (LAS) in response to Chomsky's LAD, Language Acquisition Device. Colvin Treverthen studied the interaction between parents and babies who were too young to speak. He concluded that the turn-taking structure of conversation is developed through games and non-verbal communication long before actual words are uttered. Now again, there are limitations of input theories too. These theories serve as a useful corrective to Chomsky's early position and seems likely that a child will learn more quickly with frequent interaction. However, it has already been noted that children in all cultures pass through the same stages in acquiring language. We have also seen that there are cultures in which adults do not adopt special ways of talking to children. So CDS may be useful but seems not to be essential. As stated earlier, the various theories should not be seen simply as alternatives. Rather, each of them offers a partial explanation of the process. So we can conclude our discussion of these theories. After discussing these theories of language acquisition along with their criticisms, we can conclude that it's not solely by imitation or interaction or the inner mechanism, but there should be an inner potential or maturity, or as Chomsky said, device, and every child is predisposed to learn language, and when he or she gets the environment, obviously he will learn the language. Thank you. There are certain references. Happy learning.